And we are now live.
Good evening. Welcome to the planning board meeting for July 15th. As with all of these online meetings, I'm going to begin with the roll call. Beth DeLeo. Here. Ann Gardner. Ann?
Yes, here.
Thank you. Tanya Hartford is absent. Leah McGavern is absent. Rick Tainter.
Here.
MJ Verde.
Here.
Don Walters.
Here.
Is Alden on yet? Not yet.
He is not yet, but I will stay tuned.
Okay, so for the moment he's absent and
Actually, it looks like he just arrived, and I'm just making sure he's listed as a panelist. Alden, are you able to announce your arrival?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. And Bonnie Sontag, I'm here. Let me begin with the agenda. We have one public hearing, Dan and Judy Lynch, 342 Merrimack Street, a 6C special permit. Then we have planning office subcommittee and discussion, approval of the minutes from July 1st, potential zoning amendments, specifically 6C, discussion, other updates. So a relatively light agenda, and we will get started. Attorney Mead, are you here?
I am.
Good, and are your clients Dan and Judy Lynch with you?
Well, not physically, but I have them on text and I believe that they're listening. So here we
Good.
are.
Okay, so I just wanted them to hear that we're very sorry that we couldn't hear them at 11 o'clock at the last meeting. I do apologize for that. And I think this is a better situation all the way around. So my understanding is that we are going to discuss the details of the draft decision. Is that your understanding, Attorney Mead?
It is, Madam Chair. And I would just say that for the record, Lisa Mead, 30 Green Street, Mead, Teller, and Costa, on behalf of the applicants, the Lynches. So to bring everybody up to speed, we did go back, or the Historic Commission did go back with the two questions that the board had relative to the shutters and the front door. And there was no issue with the proposal on the front door, and the shutters, they had no issue with either. They said they would leave it up to the applicants. So there are no changes to the plans that were presented before. And those are the plans that would become part of the preservation restriction. And so, yes, Madam Chair, we are at the point where we're discussing the decision and findings, which is where this all left off the last time.
Good. Andy, I just wanted to double check with you. If we're still in the public hearing, would you like me to call for public comment before we move on?
Yeah, I actually noticed in the audience, I think we only have the applicant and Attorney Mead at present. So
Okay.
certainly we could open it up for a moment, but there's no one else here.
Okay, open and closed, just to make sure that we follow all the procedures. Okay, that would mean pulling up the draft decision. We have some changes in language since the draft decision was sent out with the staff report last week. So why don't we look, actually, Andy, could we go to the original draft decision, because there's one finding for which a member wanted to have some clarification. Remember, it's the first finding. They're bullet points. They're not numbered.
It's on page 2 of the
Yeah.
decision.
Yeah, it's in red here. And I just wanted to get this put to bed, and then we'll go. The other copy he had up covers everything else that's been updated. So I believe, Don, you had this was your question. Is that correct?
Maybe he's muted.
So my question with respect to this one, Bonnie, and all, it says that the lot is conforming, and I wasn't sure whether, with respect to this addition, whether it was still conforming or it would have been conforming subject to a dimensional variance by the ZBA. That was the question I had.
Because the finding requires that the applicant include a conceptual by right development plan, meaning no variances, no special permits, just the way it could be built. So yes, can you speak to that, please?
Yes, absolutely. So indeed, it is a pre-existing non-conforming lot, but to put an addition on the rear would not require a variance, Mr. Walters. An addition on the rear could be configured, so it wouldn't even require a special permit. So it would certainly not require variance. We did get a variance for that rear setback on the new house because of putting it closer to the street at the request of the board, but we could put an addition on this house without a variance for sure. And it's already a two-family use.
And again, I surely don't, I understand the two-family. I guess my question was on the extension in the back, and just for my own edification, I should know this like I'm breathing now, my apologies, is because you're not increasing the nonconformity with respect to increasing in the back, you're not limited by the 500 square feet. You can make it as long as you, as far as you wanted to, until you finally hit the rear setback or some other dimensional control, lot area coverage or something, or something else. Am I correct, either Lisa and or Andy or anyone else in the board for that matter?
No, no, we would limit it. It would have to, so first of all, it's already a two-family use, since there's already 2 units in there. And we could increase it by 1,000 square feet. That would be 500 per unit. And you could do that without either a special permit or a variance.
Correct. So you are limited to 1,000 square feet. That was my only question. And you know, we can go on. It's not material right now. It was just the way it was by right. It was by right only for up to 1,000 feet, not to the same size that they're putting a second facility on, or second structure. That was my only point, but we don't need to belabor it, Bonnie.
Okay, so yeah, they can put forward a by right plan that doesn't go beyond the total of 1,000 square feet. Yeah, good. But thank you for bringing it up. It's part of our education and we can all benefit from that. The rest of the changes then, or the clarification of language, will be on the other document, Andy, that you did pull up, and we can look at that now. Yeah. I had asked for language to be added to the special permit finding 9 because it was just left off. And so this is just clarifying that the proposed use shall not be conducted in a manner, et cetera, et cetera. That's straightforward, I believe. Andy, I would appreciate it, since you came up with this language after we discussed it at the preparatory meeting, to walk us through this. And I don't know, Attorney Mead, if you were part of any of this. Did you have some changes in language in this section as well?
So Andy did talk to me about this because we have been going back and forth relative to the discussion at the last meeting. So he did talk to me about it, and you know, myself and my clients are fine with this, and so I'll have Andy walk you through it, because I think it recognizes the burdensome nature of the preservation restriction process, but B, protects the city and the board at the same time, making sure that the process is in fact engaged in. So Andy, I'll let you go through it if that's what the chair would prefer.
Sure. Yeah. You know, I agree with Attorney Mead. What we're trying to do here is based on a number of different factors related to the preservation restriction, which is the core public benefit that's coming with this 6C grant of special permit. the things we're trying to balance here, and this is what these two conditions are intended to accomplish. And I think that it would be good for us to use this structure going forward where there is a preservation restriction involved. What we're trying to do is basically make sure that people are moving ahead, applicants are moving ahead, in this case, this particular applicant, moving ahead with getting a final drafted perpetual preservation restriction that is ready and has been submitted to the Massachusetts Historical Commission, as well as the local commission, of course, because what we've seen over the years is that those things are not always followed up on in a timely manner. That being said, I agree with Attorney Mead, the process of getting a preservation restriction reviewed and approved by the state, in addition to the local commission, is a time-consuming process, and there's just inherent monthly delays. So it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. So because of that, what we're trying to do here is make sure that the applicant moves ahead with preparing that draft document, because that is something within their control. And then, but allow the construction work for the project to proceed in compliance with the stipulations that would be in that PR and that the Historic Commission has already outlined, which is what's underneath condition number 2 there. It's the bullet list underneath with the letters. That is to sort of balance out the time frame that's involved with Massachusetts Historical Commission review, and the applicants need to make some sort of progress in their project. Having talked to Jennifer Blanchet, our zoning administrator, we were in agreement that that's a reasonable balance of those issues and something that she deals with on a regular basis in reviewing, the issuance of building permits. So the bottom line, I guess, is that special condition number 2, obviously the sub-bullet list speaks to the preservation restriction elements that the Historic Commission had recommended. And the important part of number 2 is it basically requires that prior to the grant of any occupancy permit for the second unit, where the applicant gets the benefit of that special permit, the preservation restriction that's final and reviewed by Mass Historical, that has to be recorded. And we also feel that that's a reasonable time frame, because even if construction work is going ahead with the bullet list of items underneath, in compliance with those, that would be subject to the special permit in the interim, the same sort of conditions, it would allow the preservation restriction to be reviewed by Mass Historical and have it routed back and forth, get all the signatures, and have that recorded at the registry. So we're basically trying to balance out the applicant's need to move ahead with some of the work that's involved with the project, while recognizing that there needs to be compliance with the PR terms, and we ultimately need a PR on record.
Madam Chair, if I could, just to let folks know, for those members who haven't been through this process before, to understand what goes into the preservation restriction. So certainly the preservation restriction, the substance and body, is a prescribed form by Mass Historic, and there are typically some changes to it, but there's some significant description and work that has to go in related to the house that's being preserved and the property. And then there is a very specific method by which photographs are supposed to be taken and labeled and laid upon the document. So once all of that happens, then it has to go to the Newburyport Historic Commission to say, yep, this is good. And once that happens, it goes to Mass Historic. And they can take, and this is not an exaggeration, and it's not their fault, they are incredibly understaffed. And I think this is, basically 1 or 2 people review all of these for the entire Commonwealth. They can take 1 to 4 months to review a document to get it back to you. And typically they have changes. And then those have to be made, and then it goes back to them again. And then the second review might be a little bit shorter, but a little bit is relative. So it might not take 4 months, it might take 3 months. And then when it comes back, if it's ready, it has to go back to the Historic Commission, which has to then vote on it and sign it. And then it has to go to the City Council, who has to review it, vote on it, and sign it. And as you know, those processes includes a referral to a subcommittee and then back out to the full council. Then it has to go to the mayor, who has to sign it. Then it has to come back to us and go back to the Historic Commission, Mass Historic Commission, who then also has to execute it. And that might take about a month or so. So it's a significant process. And I think that this is a fair process, but it also protects the city in making sure that it's moving forward.
Thank you very much. I didn't know it was all that back and forth, so thank you for that explanation. Board members, any other additions, comments on this draft decision?
I had a couple of very small points that I'd like to raise. On 2B, talking about the front portico, I think the word should be shall rather than may in that location, because otherwise it leaves it open as to not removing it and not restoring the front elevation.
This is Andy, and having attended the Historic Commission meetings, I think the commission felt that either scenario might have been appropriate or reasonable. But given that the applicant's proposing to remove it here, I agree that it would be fine to change it to shall, and I wouldn't think the applicant would object. I don't know if Attorney Mead could speak to that.
That's our preference, so we don't have a problem with that.
And the second point was on G, and it's just a grammatical issue. The way it reads, the front of the house may have all shutters removed or may remain in place, which means the front of the house may remain in place. So I think what it means, it should say the shutters on the front of the house may be removed or may remain in place.
We're fine with that too.
Just a clarification, because we don't want to leave things ambiguous.
We won't be removing the front of the house.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you. Anybody else? So I'd like a motion, please.
I move to, was it a move to approve or is it a move to?
Well, I didn't say. Do I usually say? I was going to start leaving it open for everybody. Motion to approve. May I have a motion to approve, please?
So moved.
Rick, thank you. And second?
Second, Ann.
Thank you, Anne. And I'll call roll. Alden Clark,
I abstain.
Beth Delisle,
Yes.
Ann Gardner,
Yes.
Rick Tainter,
Yes.
MJ Verde.
I assume I can be a yes because we did not
Yes.
talk about it last time, correct?
No, we did not.
Okay, yes.
Don Walters,
Yes.
Bonnie Sontag, yes. You have your approved decision.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for having it be before 11 o'clock.
All right. Board members, we're going forward with what's going to turn out to be a discussion of the minutes from July 1st. And let me just do an introduction to this before we get started. I'm going to ask for a motion and then a second, and then we'll have discussion. At that point, I would like anyone who wants to suggest changes for clarification of your comments during the Institution for Savings application review. There was some concern that the way it was written up, it was hard to tell when one member stopped speaking and the next one started, as well as some other issues. And Linda has agreed to edit them according to any member's request for clarifying statements. We cannot deliberate, as you well know. I'm sure I don't have to say it, but I want to say it for the record anyway. And after we're finished tonight, tonight or tomorrow, submit any change of language to Linda and where it should go into the document so she knows where your comments should be and what they should replace. And she will also have access to the recording so she can double check, because she can tell from, the voices, and we usually say our name, who is starting to say what at what point. So she will do that replacement based on anybody's submission who feels that they, having read her minutes, would rather have a more clarifying statement. And so I'm going to ask anybody who does want to do that to read it into the record tonight. So with that said, may I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Thank you, Don. And could I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Rick. And now I'll call for discussion. And we don't have to go in order of the comments, but I thought I'd kick it off because I had made a statement at the very beginning of our round of discussions to clarify or to explain the regulations that were in place and under which we were reviewing the application. So that opening paragraph should read as follows. And I'm at this point, because I'm acting in my role as chair, I'm going to recommend that my name be used, but that is not what we'll continue with a member said, unless you feel otherwise. But at this point, I'd like to say, Chair Sontag explains zoning regulations relevant to the application. The DOD ordinance takes precedent over the underlying zoning for the special permit. Site plan review is relevant because more than 1,000 square feet is being added. The applicant falls within the B2 dimensional controls that allow 40-foot heights and 0 setbacks. The proposed addition meets all requirements for the zoning district. The zoning provisions of site plan review and the DOD set the measure of how the board deals with this application. And I will submit that to Linda to replace the first paragraph. Other members, is there anybody else who would like to change so as to clarify their statements?
Yes, Bonnie, I was the next speaker for the next paragraph. And I only have 3 very simple changes that, Linda, I hope you could take tonight. Is Linda with us?
She is, but she's typing, so it's hard for her
Okay.
to.
Hi, Ann. I
Yeah.
can. You just need to give me a minute to call up the draft.
Okay, thank you. It's page 9.
7-1 notes, institution for savings. All right, so I extracted the institution for savings from the draft just for this purpose, so I don't have page numbers. Let me just get
Oh.
oriented. All right, he presented, Bonnie did her thing, right.
Yeah, it's right after Bonnie's comments.
All right, there's Glenn Richards, there's public comments, hold on.
Right at the end of public comment, closed for the evening.
Yep,
Yeah.
so
And-
member comments.
All right, that's Bonnie's paragraph. And then if you go to the next one, for the DOD special permit findings,
Yes,
okay. If you would, in that sentence, change the proposed design will impair, change that to could.
all right, the proposed design will, and
Yeah.
Andy, you want me to attribute this to your name?
It doesn't matter. You don't have to, but I would strike will and say could, because I believe I was just
I think
suggesting.
we already, okay, I had
Okay.
could,
Yeah, could and take out will.
okay.
And then if you can move down to the 5th line,
Let me just highlight that so I can see it. Yep, 5th line,
okay, the applicant,
yep.
okay, instead of should review,
Mm-hmm.
the applicant might review their program for the space to evaluate if everything is truly essential to their, I would strike the whole rest of that sentence, and after to their, simply put financial viability. Because
Got it.
that was my point. Did they need everything in that building for their future financial viability, which they said over and over again? So
Okay.
did you get that, Linda?
I have could impair, might review, and financial viability.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chair Sontag, this is Andy. I'd like to make a suggestion wherever possible. I think, I know that Linda in the past has taken, I think she still takes notes according to who's spoken. She may have merged some of these things together in paragraphs at prior requests. But I think it makes sense going forward for all the minutes to attribute comments to which member might have said them. It makes it a lot clearer in the future as to how things if the paragraphs don't say that in some way, it becomes hard to distinguish who is saying what.
Okay, I have no problem. I think all of the comments in that paragraph reflected mine, so.
Can I go back? Thank you, Ann. Can I go back to Andy's comment? There are two different issues here. One is separating out one member's comments from another. And we've continued to do that most recently by saying a member said, another member said, a member said. So that would take care of that problem. The other issue is for years, we haven't identified who said what. And I'd like to hear other people's comments about that. Are there any downsides to putting our names in or positives for putting our individual names in? Could I have some comment on that, please?
No, I'm happy to start off. It seems to me if it's a public hearing and we make a comment, it's okay for me if the public reads it and understands it was my comment versus someone else's without, they don't know which member, or they could not remember, or they were not at the meeting, so they wanted to perhaps understand which member. So I'm okay with it, but I'll go with the flow.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think that most other public boards do that. And yeah, I think we should.
And I agree. I think it's sometimes confusing if two members say something slightly different or even very different, and it sounds like we're contradicting ourselves. So I think it's better to have the comments attributed to the person.
I would agree.
So can I just say one thing? They'll be attributed to the person who first says it. Because I know I miss all the time, but I try not to repeat it when you say the same things.
You should though. I mean,
Okay.
because with the public, we ask them to say, I agree with, what's been said before or with an individual, because it gives weight to that comment.
Mhm.
So I'm glad we're having this conversation because I think it's important if three members agree on one point and then
Mhm.
others disagree or they don't care or whatever. It helps us when it comes time when it gets controversial, to make a decision.
Okay.
Okay, everybody? Oh, so that's good. All right. Please don't do Chair Sontag. It sounds like my comments are more important. So just if you want to just go with last names, or I don't know what's appropriate, but just treat me like another member when you're listing, if you don't mind. Except
Okay.
in this case where I made a statement for the board.
Okay.
Okay, clarification, edits from other members, please. Anybody else?
Well, going on to the next paragraph after Ann's paragraph, and there's a section, I think that's largely me talking there, and then there's a section which I think is Attorney Mead responding. I think or somebody from the
It
applicant.
couldn't be because I'm sorry to interrupt. We only gave our statements without any interruption. I did that on purpose.
Okay, so in that case, I don't know, there's this section about being careful, talking about parking issues and a perspective placing the building in the back of the site makes the historic.
That's Tanya.
I think that was
She's the next
Tanya.
speaker.
Okay.
And I have Tanya's comments. And so if you do yours, I'll do Tanya's afterward.
Because I think it was all in one paragraph. That was where the confusion.
That's where the confusion was.
Okay.
Okay. So
Yeah, I just had some very small kind of clarification questions. I don't think you want to go through them all unless you do. I mean, they're not major things.
well, I mean, if they're minor enough, you just write it up and give it to
Yeah, I've done
Linda,
that.
and she'll replace wherever it's necessary.
Yeah, I've done that.
Okay.
And
All
I
right.
have,
And Rick, I'm sure that paragraph is all you because it's the longest paragraph.
And the most insightful as well.
Of course.
Okay,
All right. So which line ends your statement? So I know where to start Tanya's.
I think it's the one that says there is a clear alternative. And I actually drafted what I thought I said, which is there's a clear alternative that might solve everybody's problems regarding the special permit and should be considered. But it's that one. So the one that begins the neighborhood should be careful is not mine.
Do you have that, Linda?
Okay. Rick,
Yeah,
are you talking about changes that I don't have from you yet?
no, I sent them yesterday.
Okay. I have your statements, and which paragraph is you again?
The planning, well, I don't remember saying the planning board had never seen this amount of opposition.
Okay, so
I think
2 or
Ann said
3
that.
minutes.
I think I said that.
Okay,
So I'll just move that up to the previous paragraph and start with the use is completely appropriate.
I think so, yes.
Okay.
And then,
Linda,
Yes.
yeah, I think Linda's going to have to go back to the recording on this because we're still guessing it where each of us stopped.
Yeah, and Bonnie, if I may, and again, I think just be sure we're all exactly on the same page. The thing that had bothered me the most, that I started to do this when I sent this to Linda, and I stopped. Linda, every time it says members, as in this is members to the entry of the expansion with it was paramount. This proposal does not do that. Again, I think we have to say what member did it or a member, because when it says members, it almost seems to imply consensus or some interim decision, et cetera, by the board. And I know that's not the intent of you, Linda, nor anyone else in the board. So again, I guess what I'm saying, but every time it says the word members, let's be sure it says what member or take out the plural.
Yeah, we've already decided it's going to be the individual person's name, so that'll
Okay, so she,
solve
again,
that problem.
and again, just so she's gonna send that again, and we'll have an individual member's name. You know, member so-and-so said that this was paramount and that it did not meet something, correct?
Correct.
Okay, I'm just
It's
being
a
sure.
redo.
Thank you.
It's a redo.
and Linda, if you don't have the version that I sent you with a lot of little changes on it, I can resend it to you again, just so you have it.
Well, I'm pretty sure I have it. I got Bonnie's first, and then I got Don's, which
Yeah.
had Bonnie's on it, and then I got yours, which
Okay.
had Don's and Bonnie's on it.
Okay, then you have it then, good.
Okay, so after Rick, starting with the neighborhood should be careful, I have comments from Tanya. She says in the margin, these were my comments, so I spent more time in making sure that they represent the intent of my feedback. So I'm going to read this at several lines, but this is what she would like her comments to say.
Are you also
And-
going to send it to me?
I think she already sent them to you, but I will definitely resend them.
I don't have anything.
Oh, you weren't copied on that. That's right. Thank you. I will send it to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. The neighborhood should be careful talking about parking issues because the bank has much more parking than a lot of businesses in the downtown. Downtown districts by nature have shared parking. In some ways, the bank has overcompensated by placing a parking garage in their proposed building, but it does meet all the parking minimums without using shared parking. The member provided, well, we'll say she in this case. She provided another perspective in that placing the new building in the back of the site makes the historic structure more prominent. Despite the missing tooth on State Street, if something were there, it would detract from the historic building. In that regard, a structure does belong on the surface parking lot. Historically, there were buildings on this lot. As for density, we have dimensional controls that dictate the size of the buildings in our zoning districts, and the applicant has shown that this building meets and is in fact under those requirements. On the building design, there is a lot of brick which ties into the 1980s addition, but not to the residential street. The member, so Tanya, agrees with the NHC that clapboard might be a better material for the Otis Place side, but the applicant has shown how brick commercial buildings tie into residential districts in other areas of the city. Newburyport's mix of residential and commercial is what makes the downtown unique. Tanya supports the NHC comment that the bump out on the Otis Place side looks out of place, and unlike the examples shown of bump outs on Otis, existing Otis Place, shown of existing bump outs on Otis Place. A straight facade would look better here. That's all she has to say. Next.
So I'm pretty sure it was Leah that spoke about the generator and the good vegetation.
Well, you'll have to look it up and find out. She didn't send us anything, so you'll just have to pull hers out the way it is and put her name with it. Does
Okay.
anyone else want to clarify their statements?
So I think my statements are the following.
This is Beth.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I need to go back and listen to see if this accurately captures what I was trying to get at. I will do that, and if there's any changes, I'll send them to Linda.
Okay.
I don't think I have anything hugely substantive.
Okay, but Linda, hold on until you've heard from Beth one way or the other. Either give her some stuff or say, no, go with what's there.
That's not a problem. This is going to be a revised draft, and I would assume that you'd want to look at it again and before you vote on it.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No, this is all considered, written input, just like we did with the previous draft decision for the applicant. So,
Okay.
although most of that was already written, I don't think we need to do that. So then, is that everybody then who was speaking on that? Yeah, I think that's everybody. Okay. So we have a motion and a second. Oh, we need needs to be as amended. Rick, you made the motion as amended, right?
I did.
Yes,
Okay, now I'm
good.
back to my minutes.
Yeah. The motion was to approve the minutes as amended.
Approve the minute. Yep, got it.
Okie dokie, any more discussion? All right, I'll take a roll call on this. Alden,
I'll abstain.
Beth,
Yes.
Anne,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ,
Abstain.
Don,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. Okay, thank you. And we've made some good clarifying decisions going forward on how the minutes should be recorded. So that was also useful. Thank you. Okie dokie. We are heading into the topic called potential zoning amendments. And we had specifically said back whenever it was, a month ago or more, that we would discuss our thoughts on 6C tonight. And I have a little preface for that as well. Only that I'm not sure we came to a conclusion when we started discussing it that we were actually going to keep it. I'm wondering if we're still on the fence about revising the ordinance or dropping it altogether. And before we get into details about revising it, I'm wondering if it makes sense just to go around and take everybody's temperature on this one, whether or not you think it's worth revising, or if you seriously think we ought to just drop the whole thing. Does that make sense to do as a first round?
Yes.
Okay, by me.
Our
Bonnie, I
most
think that's a good
knowledgeable
idea.
member. Okay, so I'll just go down the list. It's easier that way. Beth, what do you think about 6C in general, about keeping it or keeping it and revising it or dropping it?
I think we should keep it, but limit the circumstances in which it can be used further to,
Okay,
I think the side by side is a better use of 6C and putting two units on one lot. And then I'm wondering, in Rick's edits, there was conversion of an accessory building. I didn't know if that was part of a different section.
well, yeah, let's get into the details of what we want to do with it once we've decided that is in fact what we want to do, which is revise it. So if we can just do a quick round on keep and revise or get rid of it, we'll know where people are coming from. And then we'll come back and look at those details for sure. Yeah. Thank you. Anne?
The biggest problem I have is when we've approved projects with a house behind a house. I just don't think that works. Although I do think within the existing 6C language, we could deny an application because it doesn't fit in with the character of the neighborhood, which is what we did on the recent one on Merrimack Street. The one we just approved tonight is probably one of the best examples I can think of a 6C. It just works on that particular lot. I do think it's a benefit to have that building under Mass Historic. And I guess my question is, could that have come about without 6C? Certainly we couldn't have had the authority to, impose the, the preservation restriction. But aside from that, if we eliminated 6C, how could that applicant have done what they did, which I think really fits in nicely to that neighborhood?
Well, I suppose they could have subdivided and just hived it off. And then it would have been developed as a separate lot.
But they wouldn't have had the restriction on the historic
No,
building.
absolutely not.
So
That's it.
I think that's one of probably the only benefit. We're not going to get any affordable housing out of it or protection of natural resource, whatever that means. But it is nice, I think, to have some long-term restrictions on historic buildings in our community. I mean, I think that's so much of what Newburyport is. So again, my question, and I don't know if Andy has an opinion or Rick, could what we did tonight have been done any other way?
This is Andy. I'm happy to speak to just the things that come to mind for me. One is, this provision starts off by clarifying what happens if someone wants to do two structures on one lot. I think there's still benefit to allowing that sort of flexibility, although I have no problem if it's by discretionary permit to make sure it's good in context. There was another 6C that the board looked at relatively recently where there was discussion about whether it made sense to have a house way at the back that didn't really fit with the form of development in the neighborhood. And I thought that was a good look at the criteria for granting of a special permit. Not just is there a public benefit being proposed, by a preservation restriction, but also is this particular project appropriate in the neighborhood? And those are both things the board should look at. So I think it makes sense to allow the flexibility of a second structure on a lot. I actually think there is still benefit to having this particular provision so that there's some level of, design review, essentially what happens for any proposed modifications as a result of needing the special permit. What I have seen over the years, and Bonnie has been looking at this longer probably than anybody here, but the public benefits sections, which is the A through C that you see on the list there, the affordable housing doesn't come up very frequently. The open space one rarely comes up as well. The PRs, the preservation restrictions, are the ones that come up most frequently. And there was discussion in the recent past about the fact that in the demolition control district that folks can't as easily demolish an entire structure as they might have previously. So while there isn't as much of a concern about the wholesale demolition of a building, there is still benefit, I think, to ensuring that there's a preservation restriction or some sort of design restrictions on the exterior of a facade to make sure that it is compatible or matches the historic design of the structure and so forth. So I guess those are generic.
So Andy, to answer my question, could we have done what we did tonight without the 6C?
So you would not have been able to put the preservation restriction as a requirement on what they were doing there, depending on whether or not this provision was rewritten to allow, a second structure on a lot. I presume that might be the outcome of any edit to the section. But if you would not have the authority to impose the preservation restriction without this section, and so that's one reason why I think there's still some benefit to the board having that ability.
I also question whether we would have been able to do this, whether they would have been able to get 2 conforming lots out of that existing lot. And would that be possible, or is that?
No, you're right. I don't think so.
Yeah, so
I don't think they have the frontage on the back.
So they would have had to get a variance, and the variance would have taken it away, basically all authority away from the planning board.
Hey, Rick, to answer you, to just follow up on that, and I was going to answer when it's appropriate, I guess it's now appropriate, and to answer your question, Ann, God bless you. God
bless me.
No, me, sorry.
That was Bonnie. God bless you, Bonnie. To the point, the ZBA could grant dimensional variances such that the lot could be subdivided. Furthermore, ZBA, to the best of my knowledge, could provide stipulations similar to what we could have done for a historic preservation. Whether they would do it is a different story, and I surely would agree, to the extent that was followed, then that control goes to the ZBA and not to the planning board.
Yeah, this is Andy. I agree with what Don has just put forward.
Okay, we're having a free-for-all on this. I drop out. Everybody, whenever you want to have a comment on anything having to do with this proposed amendment, go for it. I'm done.
Okay, I think it seems to me that there is value in having this section and looking at revising it, just from my point of view so far.
So my concern is that although the language seems to imply that we're only allowing one more dwelling, in fact, in the past, it's been used to allow multiple dwellings and multiple dwelling units. So if we keep it, I would like to make sure that it's clear that this is only for adding an additional dwelling and not for allowing 2 or 3 dwellings or multi-family dwellings, because I think those should be taken care of through something that is probably tailored more to that. And I think I'm kind of at a, I have difficulty understanding exactly where this should go without knowing what we're doing with the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, because I think this and that should mesh together, and we should be able to treat the range of additional dwelling units going from the very small accessory dwelling units to a full-size house. And so ultimately, I think that I guess what I threw out was just what I would want to, if we were to keep it, that's what I would want to keep, but I don't know whether it fits in with the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, because I haven't seen that yet. In terms of the preservation restriction, the comments that I made the last time we talked about this were that I feel I don't like it when we trade something for something that is unrelated to it. And I feel that increasing density is not necessarily trying to trade off a preservation to increasing density is not like for like. But I do understand the importance of preserving historic structures. So I would suggest that one thing we could consider is that we could go through a whole range of criteria for when we would allow a second unit on a lot, a second structure on a lot. And then one of the conditions would be, if there is a historic structure, that historic structure must be preserved. So we're not trading that off. We're basically saying that's something we have to do no matter what if you get a special permit. So that it's kind of a fine distinction, but I think I just don't like the idea of trading one for the other, but I do like the idea of requiring it.
I've got a couple of comments on this, and part of them, Rick, was based on your email that you had sent around earlier, or Bonnie did. Thank you for getting us all started. It was a bit unclear to me whether, Rick, your comments or more importantly, overall, when there is an ADU, if there is a 6C, does that mean that a 6C will take the place of an ADU, or could you have a 6C, i.e. another structure? And then also 2 ADUs. My sense is that because generally a 6C unit, separate unit is larger, we would allow one or the other. You cannot double dip, so to speak. That's my first comment or thought. The second one is I wasn't sure. Again, Rick, to your comment, I understand the historic part, but if there was no historic element to be saved, I was assuming that you still feel that there should be some type of contribution to the city for allowing some increased density on that particular lot. And if not, that's okay. I will just tell you, my thought has always been, if the developer is getting a significant increase in value, and I don't think it's fair to the city, whether it's the fabric, the character, whatever, of the neighborhood, for that developer to get all of that money as compared to providing some of it back to the neighborhood or the city. So I guess those are my first 2 comments right now. And I guess, I'm sorry, a third is with respect to having side-by-side, I think Ann brought up a good point. I think maybe it's side-by-side and if it's on a corner lot, so to speak, or where it has existing road frontage, because if it's just side-by-side, and we would not be able to approve what you mentioned was probably one of the better examples you saw. But if we also include it or on an existing private or public right-of-way, perhaps that would be one way that we could provide some incremental flexibility. Just throwing some stuff against the wall. Thanks, Bonnie.
I saw the early ADU draft language, which I did not like at all. I find it extraordinarily restrictive in terms of limiting not only square footage, but 1 bedroom for the AD unit and only 1 bathroom. Anyway, so no, I don't think it's a replication to have ADU in what we've seen under the CC. They are larger housing units, and I personally think those units should not be as tiny as currently proposed. Anyway, I see them as different.
Yes, as far as comments on, I'm assuming that what Rick drafted is meant to replace the entire 6C paragraph that exists today.
Yeah, I just threw it out there for
Right.
discussion purposes.
Right. So given that piece and some of the comments, the section 2 of the existing one, where it talks about a clear public benefit, you've dropped that altogether in your draft. There's no reference to any of that. And I'd asked that once before when we started discussing this, if there was, if what was the benefit, or was it just those things, or was, for example, in getting something back to the city, is it just the benefit of having a increased tax base as being a benefit to the city? Yeah, if that was enough. And I think what Don was saying, he thought I think he thinks that's not enough. He saw some advantage to having some additional benefit to the city, but you've dropped that out altogether. So I don't know if that's an issue for people or not. Otherwise, I think the language that you've used expands on the conditions where it would be allowed and what types of things would be allowed. I think it's much clearer, being more specific. And I think that's a help to a developer looking at this or someone applying for this to say, what is it within the acceptable range? It's much clearer than the existing language, I think. Yeah. So basically, otherwise, the other 4 criteria that from the original language, you have some pieces of it in your draft, which I think is good, and as I said, I think it makes it clearer. You are a little more strict on the size of the second building when that reference is, because yours says it's 20% smaller as opposed to 10%, and I think that was a topic that was brought up before in some of the discussion, saying, are we trying to limit the density, and is that something that we all think we should be doing here? And I think your language is more specific on the whole located entirely within the envelope language, where you specify what's allowed, and some of your points, I think, says it's not quite entirely within the envelope if you had a dormer or whatever, but it limits the size, and again, it's more specific, which I think is helpful. I don't know if these issues have come up, but just from my newer perspective on this, that's what it seemed to me. There's also more leeway on the side-by-side setback, where the existing language just seems to say side-by-side, and you're more specific with the 10 feet, within 10 feet of the setback. I noticed that the original one had the plan providing adequate access language, and you don't really mention that in your redraft. And I just wondered if that was covered elsewhere, if it was covered in the subdivision language that's referred to in your draft. Again, I'm not familiar with all the other provisions, so I'm not sure if that's something that needs to be in there, or if it's covered by some of the other language by following existing regulations for subdivisions and so forth that you mentioned. And again, I just talked about how, yeah, it delineates the planning board criteria, for example, in item 2C, which I think is good. Gives more information to anyone that's trying to utilize this section. The only other comment I had, it no longer refers back to the 10H.7 and 10H.8 special permit and the process for that. And I don't know if this is just assumed, since you mentioned special permit in some of the intro language of yours, so that of course it would fall under that. So I didn't know if that was an issue. I assume those still apply, and I think we're assuming that, but I don't know if people are concerned that we don't specifically refer back to that as part of getting a special permit. So those are some of my comments. I don't know if there's any response to a few of those, but I'm willing to hear or see what people think if we need some of those things.
I'll let everybody else respond.
So anybody who hasn't spoken yet, I guess that's MJ. Do you have any comments?
No, I was pretty much feeling similar in all my thoughts to what Anne was getting at, which is, when are the cases going to come up that we can make this, or should this go away? Because there are cases that come up that seems like we get stuck having to take on this preservation issue. Like Rick said, the affordable housing and the conservation or DON resources don't come up. So I think Rick's rewrite is much more thorough. So I was a little bit more on the fence before about getting rid of it, but I think actually keeping it gives us a little bit more control. So that's my general comment.
So it sounds like then you, just building on what you said for everybody, we're okay with revising it, keeping it and revising it, and making it work for us as the permit granting authority. Is that a fair statement?
That's me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, Anne, you're looking, I'm going to use this, you're being thoughtful looking. Let's hear it.
I know it doesn't happen that often.
No, I'm glad I can see you because I can't see everybody at once.
You know, I also think that as a board, we are more confident about denying 6C applications, which was not necessarily true in the past. So I feel a lot more comfortable that we can say no to something that really wouldn't work, like the Merrimack Street one. I also, you know, so I think if we kept 6C, even as it is now, we could control things that we found undesirable. And I'm also thinking, you know, we've had a committee doing city zoning for, oh, I don't know, I was on it 2 years ago. Now, when is that ever going to happen? And should this be part of that process? And I think there's some overlap with accessory units and some of the language here. I'm much more concerned about getting a good accessory unit or ordinance. So, you know, I'm concerned that we pick apart little things at zoning every once in a while. And when are we going to do the whole thing, importantly?
Andy, would you please speak to that as clearly as you possibly can at this point?
Yeah, thank you. Just to be clear, so it's a monumental task to update the ordinance and to get it through all the process involving all the people who want to be sort of cooks in the kitchen, if you will. So what has happened with that project is we got a fair amount of the rewrite done, and then we got bogged down with these other, as Ann mentioned, these piecemeal amendments that come forward with things that I don't necessarily always think are the most urgent issues, but we've been trying to do a comprehensive update to the ordinance to clarify terms and so forth. To tonight's discussion address the accessory dwelling units, for instance. There wasn't consensus in the zoning advisory committee on the 6C portion. I think there was deference to the planning board to figure what would make sense. So we have components. We've been talking with, Jennifer and I have been talking with Councilor Eigenman, working to bring forward a chunk of the rewrite that we have worked on. Of course, you would have to weigh in on that with your public hearing, but that would allow us to get at least a portion of the rewrite through some of the framework, and then we could work on remaining sections. The problem that we run into the most is when we start working on a section, because it's integrally tied to other sections, when we start working on those, we start circling back on other terms and things. And there is only a certain amount of bandwidth, unfortunately, as I would use the term, that the council or others have with public meetings and the number of things that they can take on themselves. So it becomes harder for us to get sponsorship of things unless they, one, are in agreement with the document, and two, feel that the council can handle it based on, you know, their review of budget cycles or other things that are going on right now, for instance, COVID. So, so there is agreement from the council president, who's been adamant about updating zoning with us, which is great. But even as recently as a week or two ago, he was also wrestling with the ties that when we start touching the dimensional table and the use table, there's still some terms we're trying to work out for definitions and whatnot. So we're getting closer to bringing forward I would say the first third or first half of the rewrite. But it's been slow going, in part because it is such a detailed document to work through. And once we get into a little detail, it can take longer.
So Andy, would the first third cover 6Cs or accessory units?
As of right now, it does not cover 6C. That, I think, again, there's some assumption that the planning board would want to weigh in on what makes sense for this provision, given this board is the one that's administered 6C over the years. But it's not included right now to be addressed. The assumption is that provision would stay as is. That could change, of course, if we have something ready and the council or councilor is willing to sponsor. For accessory dwelling units, that is something we've talked about trying to incorporate within there, but we need to discuss that a little further to agree and circling back with the zoning advisory committee and this board what would make sense for accessory dwelling units. For instance, using, a primary structure, only expansions of certain size to sort of limit their size. Maybe it's allowed in carriage houses or accessory structures that otherwise meet zoning, but there might be some desire to limit the size of them to essentially indirectly enforce them to be little a affordable because they're smaller. There's other details like that to work out, but unfortunately what we got from the consultant for the accessory dwelling units didn't really resolve the issues. And then we sort of went on a hiatus a little bit with the COVID thing. We're open to input on that, and it's possible it could be incorporated, but as of right now, it was not a key component. The idea was to get the dimensional table updated, the use table updated, and the definitions involved with them. And then there's a couple of map adjustments. But the other details would remain to be seen if we have sections or provisions that everybody can sort of have consensus over.
So just to clarify, if we as a board go forward with a revision of 6C, I have two questions. One is it, and this is for Andy, I think, but there others may want to dive in. Is it realistic to expect that we can do a 6C revision and ignore anything that the accessory unit amendment might have in it because it's going to come later? And number two, if we do go forward with a revision, could we then propose that a counselor or two sponsor it and we take it forward sooner rather than later and keep it separate from the package, as it were, of zoning rewrite?
Yes, to your last question, I would agree. I think that you could certainly package it separately. We could get a sponsor for a relatively smaller amendment. I think it'd be a lot easier to move that through given the discussion that might happen at length on the dimensional table or use table. Yeah, I think that would be great. And I'm sure that if we could walk through the rationale for the changes with a counselor to get their sponsorship, I'm sure we could get that through as a separate amendment, or at least brought on the floor for debate on a separate amendment. The accessory dwelling unit component, this provision, the 6C, is really about having a second residential structure on a lot. So while there is some interplay there between the two, from my perspective, I think what I have heard dialogue about and what seems to be important is the accessory dwelling units are, they provide some additional revenue for folks that are, trying to take care of their properties, for instance. That's come up. But also they're an opportunity to provide some little a affordable units in the community if they are reasonably sized, or smaller size as opposed to, gargantuan, or as the 6C sometimes allows, whole houses. That's not necessarily affordable housing. So I wouldn't argue there's a public benefit from that necessarily. But certainly with accessory dwelling units, that can happen. The real debate, I think, might be more so with the accessory dwelling units provision, because depending on where we come to some consensus on what those allowances would be, there could be a fair number of those that are allowed. And I would certainly acknowledge that there are a bunch of accessory dwelling units out there. I wouldn't necessarily say that they've all come in for permitting. But that being said, I think we need to recognize that if we open up the doors too much with accessory dwelling units, we might have too many of them. But at the same time, there is a benefit, I think, in the city to having smaller units that are not whole houses. Because certainly there are people in the community who need to live in something that's a little bit more affordable.
So while we're on this topic, for those of you who have voiced concerns about the intersection between the 6C and the accessory unit ordinance, do you still have questions that would limit your ability to determine if the 6C revisions are okay on their own?
Well, I'll start. I would like to be able to do those two things together, accessory dwelling unit and 6C. I think it would make a lot more sense to do them as a unit, because I think they're related and they're part of a spectrum going from a small additional unit to a larger, to maybe a conversion of a carriage house to a true standalone house. If that's not going to be possible, I think it's possible to replace the existing 6C with something that's better anyway, recognizing that if or whenever accessory dwelling units come up, we may have to come back to 6C and take another look at it to make sure that they work together. I think in short, I guess, without accessory dwelling units, I think we can easily improve 6C. And at some point in the future, if accessory dwelling units are ever enacted, then we may want to look back at 6C and see if there's further work that needs to be done.
This is
Okay.
Andy. If I might suggest that, I know your next meeting might be lengthy for another project, but perhaps the meeting after that, if the chair and board feels comfortable, we could add to that agenda the discussion of both the 6C, circling back on this, but also a draft accessory dwelling units ordinance. Jennifer and I can finish up our review of what we got from Community Opportunities Group and try to incorporate the adjustments we felt were necessary so that we could then have that discussion here. And obviously there's the sort of zoning advisory committee. It's a composition of council members and ZBA members and planning board members and staff, but to basically at least have that discussion of, as Rick's mentioned, both accessory dwelling units and whatever edits you feel are appropriate for 6C, including or not including the draft that Rick put together.
That would be,
I guess my thought on it is I think both are important, and I believe that considering both together is advantageous. However, aside from whether one versus the other would be approved by the city council, I think from a strategic point of view or from an overall master planning point of view, I would view having an ADU zone, a new zoning, more important than the 6C. Or I'll use the word critical versus important to differentiate the two.
but you wouldn't be opposed to discussing them together.
No, not at all. Absolutely. In fact, I said that was my preference. Actually, I think they're better to look at them as a whole. But going back to my initial comment earlier in the meeting, Bonnie, one of the questions I had as an example, we just approved the 6C. Would an ADU, if there was in it, would that mean each of those two, the existing house and the new house, could each have an ADU? So I don't know the answer to that or what the intent would be of the board, but that would be an example where we just need to be sure we have the verbiage right in either the 6C or probably more appropriately the ADU.
Right, okay. I think, Beth, you had a question early on about accessory units versus and 6C. Am I remembering that correctly? And has it been addressed tentatively anyway?
Yeah, I think it's been addressed.
Okay, so the idea that we would look at them together would help.
Yeah.
with-
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is in timing, right? Are we happy with 6C since we don't know when the accessory dwelling unit provisions are gonna be finalized? Are we okay with 6C remaining and having 6C projects come before us and be under this standard?
Yeah. Well, we're going to have it for now anyway, because until it moves forward officially, we'll have to entertain applications under the existing one.
Right.
But it sounds like there are good starting points with what Rick has put in his draft, and that we can look at those with the proposed ADU ordinance amendment, whatever, that Andy could provide us by, and I've looked at the calendar, August 19th. So we could tentatively schedule that for that night based on having the time to do it. Coming back to the 6C, there were a whole bunch of questions that Alden asked using Rick's draft as so the baseline. And I'm wondering if there's anything specific there, Rick, that you remember that you wanted to address, or anything that you wanted to pull out for further discussion at this point, given that you put the thought into writing it up. I'll let you drive the conversation at this point.
Well, one thing that is I think we should discuss is on my copy of it. It's the bottom of page 1. It's item C. It says one new residential building may be located behind an existing dwelling. I'm not sure whether I agree with that at all. I just threw it in there because that's what we've been allowing, and I wanted to throw that out for discussion. If it were me, I would cut that out altogether, but I didn't want to. I wanted to give people the option of thinking about that. So that's
On my copy, Rick, I have next to that a big question mark, and then next to that I have why. Because
Yeah.
I think that's what's gotten us in the most trouble in the past in terms of, and that's what I think this community is really sick and tired of, and what they refer to as infill.
Yeah.
Is this house behind a house, which does not follow the historical housing patterns of our community. So I would take that out.
it's like we're sitting next to each other.
Or do we want to have something that refers to access? Is it the access issue that,
See, the thing we approved tonight, they weren't next to each other, but they
Right.
were fabulous because they'll both have different street fronts. You know what I mean? I mean, that one made a lot of sense.
So that's a good point.
So yeah, I don't want to get too restrictive, but I do want to try to get at what we've been struggling with.
And I guess I felt that, so to the question that Alden asked about removing the access, whatever the wording was, providing, the plan provides adequate ways for furnishing access to each site. I guess if we took out the rear structure, take out item C that I have here, add in something that you and Don have both talked about is if both structures have frontage on a street, so something like what we've just approved, and then item B here, conversion of an accessory building, like a carriage house or something like that. Then I think we've handled the access issues. They're either at the same street, at a different street, or they're already served by a driveway. And so I think that is adequate. I think with the one that we denied on Merrimack Street, we talked about that adequate access issue, and we ultimately, it wasn't going to have the access that would be required under subdivision. So I think that if it hadn't been for the fact that the house was in the back of the lot, it could have been approvable. I think we're talking about a lot of the same things. So a limited scale, so not more than one additional dwelling structure. I think we need to resolve the question that Don asked about, can you pile 2 accessory dwelling units on 2 dwellings? So you end up with 4 units. And then talk about the options for layout.
Just one comment on what I thought I heard from some of the discussion previously was the reason for the section C, which you just talked about potentially getting rid of, having the second unit behind the other, was the idea was having it be limited in size, and that was a way to try to encourage more affordable housing rather than a large kind of thing. I thought that was sort of the point of that, and limiting the size of it. And so I don't know if people are concerned about that there's no provision if we're trying to enforce creating more affordable housing.
I think Andy was referring to the accessory dwelling unit ordinance to promote smaller sized units, not 6C.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I think the reason for the smaller unit now has to do with it being subsidiary, has it to do with it being behind the existing house. If we get rid of that part of the ordinance, then we don't have to have necessarily, unless we want to, a restriction on the size.
And I agree with that. And I think that the other point that I was making is if we if you had a subsidiary requirement, say it's 10% less or 20% less, that can still be a pretty big house if you're adding it to a big house. So that was what we were talking about at that one we denied, which was that it certainly met the 10% less, but it was still a big house in a backyard. So I think that if we didn't have the backyard option, that if the only backyard option we allowed was an existing accessory structure like a carriage house, then I think you wouldn't have the same concerns about impacting community character and density.
Right. And then
Right.
the subsidiary requirement would go away in the 6C, but the piece about providing more small A affordable could then be handled under the accessory dwelling unit amendment.
Yes.
So we still don't drop that when the affordable housing people come down on us. But speaking
Well,
of,
I'd like to still keep that open because I think there are a lot of benefits to accessory dwelling units that are greater than 500 square feet with one bathroom. So,
no,
I'm
I
not going to give that up.
no, I wasn't going to say that it has to be that minute. I was just saying in principle, if we cannot justify, and I think that's a better way to put it, a subsidiary, in quotes, requirement in this ordinance, because it was originally meant to make the second house supposedly more affordable. At least we would have accessory dwelling units that are more affordable, regardless of whether, we decide that's, I don't even want to put a number out there, whatever the size of that building is. It's just the concept that we're not trying to deal with, we're not trying to deal with affordable units with this 6C.
Right.
Okay, but that then leads us to the question about preservation of historic houses. There was somewhere along the line, someone suggested throwing that in here somewhere.
It was my suggestion to say that that not have it as part of a trade-off, but just have it as a requirement that if there's a historic structure, it must be preserved. And we'll write the language, however.
Yeah, I like that.
I'd like to add one more thing about accessory dwelling units. And again, not having seen the draft, and I don't know what direction people were going, but and to Anne's concern about floor area, I would recommend or suggest that we consider something where a very small accessory dwelling unit is allowed as a right, and a larger accessory dwelling unit requires a special permit, so that we could have the 500 or 600 or 700 square foot. In New Hampshire, it's 700, but to have just say a 700 square foot accessory dwelling unit is allowed as of right, but there is the option to grant a special permit for something larger than that. And then you, because I think that the thing about not requiring a special permit is huge. If you allow it as a right, that really gets to the affordability and gives people a lot of opportunity to do things.
That's a great idea.
Just to clarify for me, when you talk about accessory dwelling unit, is that potentially it's all new construction and not necessarily attached to the existing?
Good question. So there are three types of accessory dwelling units. One is creating an accessory dwelling unit in an existing house. So you don't see the difference from the outside. You go through the same doorway, etc. The next one is adding an extension onto a house, a small addition onto a house. And then the third one is building something new. And you can, whatever zoning you write, can address 1, 2, or 3 of those. You don't have to go, so you could say, we don't care what happens inside the 4 walls of your existing house. You can chop it up and create an accessory dwelling unit and rent that out and do that by right. There are issues around that relating to public safety. There may be some health requirements, some sprinkling requirements, that sort of thing. So I don't know the details of that. That's something that that Jennifer would have to advise us on. But you could certainly do that and allow that by right. You could allow somebody to put an extension on their house up to a certain size and allow them to do that by right also. When you start putting a second building in, building something for a lot of people are doing tiny homes, that type of thing. You may want to start looking at a special permit for that.
But Rick, can I just ask, so if that were applied to the lot that the 6C we rejected on Merrimack Street, I mean, could they just plop down a 500 square foot accessory unit in the backyard?
I would say that would only be by special permit.
But if there was a threshold for size that we're saying.
So I think there's a threshold for size and a threshold for type. So an attached unit versus a detached unit.
Yeah, so you're saying if it's a detached, that would always require a special permit.
Yeah, I don't know, again, I don't know which way the city has been going in the draft so far, but that's I've written it that way in the past, and I think it could work.
Rick, I have a question on your 4B. 2A, 4B. Okay, so here we're talking about an accessory building, such as garage, the converted building shall not be increased in height. Now, I have a house with an attached garage, and my garage roof line is much lower than my house roof line. Why wouldn't I want to be able to go up a little higher on my existing garage?
If you have an attached garage, it's not a separate building. So it would be expanding your house. So it would be so two parts to that question. I think the only reason we need this gets back to the other thing. The only reason we need B is if we don't have an accessory dwelling unit ordinance.
Okay.
So I mean that's why these things you can't really treat them separately. I included it in there because we don't have an accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Once we have an accessory dwelling unit that allows detached accessory dwelling units, then we don't need that anymore.
Right. Okay. And when you say at the end here, dormers, porches, decks not exceeding 300 square feet, the 300 square feet refers to the dormers, porches, or decks, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And again, it's just thrown out there for discussion. It's not meant to be any kind of final recommendation.
Well, Rick, I would love you to look at the draft accessory zoning that the group has come up with. Yeah, that'd be interesting to get your comments.
Andy, is that something that could be distributed before the second August meeting?
Yeah, that's what we just discussed a few minutes ago. I also just want to clarify, and maybe I misunderstood a comment of yours on item 4B that Ann was referencing, but I think the primary intent of the accessory dwelling units provision was to clarify what the requirements are and to, at least again, from the housing trust end, which is the primary public benefit area that I think is important here, is trying to make sure that we're providing some smaller, more affordable units in the community. The council is expecting to pick up the discussion on that same August 19th meeting about the short-term rental units. And I know there's been a little bit of an overlapping discussion about whether or not short-term rental units might adversely impact the small rental units that might be available, with accessory units. But I guess my point here is that the primary reason I think for the accessory dwelling units was not just for accessory structures or accessory buildings like a carriage house, but actually just to make sure that there's a clear process and that we're allowing them a little bit more easily than what we could refer to them today as, which is in-law apartments that are really family only. And that, I think, is serving a relatively small segment of the community, not what's really needed by some of, say, the service sector, folks who need more affordable places to live. So I just wanted to, keep in mind that the 6C section right now is currently dealing with whether or not someone gets relief to have a second structure that's for residential use in the lot, whereas the accessory dwelling unit could be either in the primary structure or an accessory structure. That depends on the terms we allow. I think our intent there was to allow both, the primary structure, maybe it's an expansion on it of a reasonable size, and accessory structures. We weren't intending it to be focused only on accessory structures.
Anything else on 6C tonight? Rick, would you propose to make any additions to your still very rough draft revision before the 19th, or you want to leave it the way it is until we see the rough draft of the ADU document?
Well, I think we could address the separate street frontage question.
Yeah.
That's one thing. I would be happy to cut out that 4C, allowing something in the back unless people have a strong desire to keep it in.
Well, that goes with what you just said. There could be a back-to-back like we just had on Merrimack and Merrimack Court, or whatever it's called back there. But you would word it differently.
Yeah.
So it's a replacement for that one, basically.
And then I would also, could throw in the bit about preserving an existing historic structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Yep. I do as well.
Okay, well, that's enough. Oh, and the third thing, there was a question here about this referring only to two single-family dwellings. And I think my assumption is that everybody agrees with you on that. That we're going to handle multiple units with something else or something that is already on the books. But this is referring to just 2 units on a property, on one parcel. We okay with that, everybody?
Yes.
Okay. This is good. I'm glad Andy brought up short-term rental units. We're trying to get the counselors to agree to have an online public hearing on it for the 19th of August. And he's working on getting a working group together before that to clean up what we know is already sort of dangling participles in that, so that there's a cleaner, rough draft for public consumption. If we don't hold it that night, at least that's the deadline by which we'd like to have a working party look at it. And I'm wondering, do we have anybody from the planning board besides me working on that particular amendment? Or was it only as part of the zoning advisory committee?
Yeah, my recollection was you did not have any other members besides yourself, Bonnie.
So this is a request to ask anybody who would like to. We could have one other person join this working group with the 2 sponsoring counselors and staff to look at that, what we left last summer as the rough draft of the ADU, and try to clarify some points in it and make it a cleaner draft going forward. Would anyone like to work on that? It would be outside of.
Are you saying ADU, Bonnie, or are you saying short-term rentals?
I meant short-term rentals. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I need somebody to join me in this session to work on short-term rental before it gets brought to the public. Anybody want to do that? I don't know what time of day or night it'll be, but I just need I would like to have another board member with me on it.
I've already submitted some fairly detailed comments. I don't know whether you have those in hand or not.
I have no idea where they are.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. I'm always happy to work on something.
Bonnie, is it possible to send out, you know, what the current draft is, as well as Rick's comments, and then have us
Ask Andy.
provide any
He's-
comments
he's
on that?
holding it. I am
Yeah,
not-
I
I do
I've
not
spoken
even
with-
have an electronic version of it, so Andy has to answer that.
Yep, I've spoken with, in the last couple of days, I spoke with Councilor Macaulay, Jim Macaulay, who's one of the primary sponsors of the ordinance, Charlie Tantra being the other, as well as Councilor Eigenman, who's interested in taking a look at the language there and assisting with trying to address some of the issues that had come up previously months ago before COVID hit, when we were working on trying to address the concerns that were raised during public comment. So they are planning on circling back with me and us then forwarding on to the group here an updated version of that. So you may want to hold off looking at the version that the council received originally, because there's going to be an updated version in the next couple of days or a week or two to look at that should be a better version.
Okay, I guess it all depends on if it's the next couple of days or a week or two or three.
Yeah.
You know, I also want to say, I think that there's going to be a lot of public comment on short-term rental units. And on that point, I want as much information as I can get as quickly as I can get. So, you know, that I can think. And then secondly, we shouldn't overload our agenda that night, because I think I think people have great interest in the topic.
Well, Andy, can you clarify?
Oh, and what about the question? Can I read Rick's comments?
Yeah, I guess, Rick, we can just confirm that these are comments that were some time back, so we can work with you just to make sure we're sending out those comments to the whole board. And I'm sorry, was there another question? I know, Bonnie, you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm getting really confused. August 19th, Andy, is the date to which the last time short-term rentals was continued.
Correct.
Are you
And-
not saying that they are going to be ready with a draft and forget this working group? And they're gonna
No. Yeah, sorry, to be clear, the intention is to have the working group circle back together again, like you mentioned earlier, but to do that before the 19th of August, looking at that updated version to work through that and then distribute that to everybody, all the counselors and all the planning board members to look at on the 19th. So I would say in the next week or so, we're probably going to, have set the time for that meeting, and we'll probably see the version coming from the counselors, the updated version to look at. Then, say a few days later, that version, assuming we're on the same page, to be sent out to the rest of the group so that everybody has a version that's more recent to look at on the 19th. And they are, in fact, interested, although Bonnie mentioned earlier, they were resistant several weeks or months back to having a zoning hearing on something that was more complicated or controversial. They wanted to deal with something small like the DOD fence amendment we just did. But now they're getting comfortable, I would say more comfortable knowing that COVID is probably going to limit physical meetings for a while. They're more comfortable with the idea of moving ahead with substantive amendments that may or may not be controversial.
So Andy, will the public have opportunity to review that before the 19th?
That really depends. I'm not sure that there'll be a lengthy amount of time. It could be as a matter of a week or so, depending on how things line up.
A week is fine.
This is
A
not
week
gonna
is
work.
fine, but people really need to be able to, get this and review it and think about it.
I'm with
Yeah,
Andy.
well, that may be one reason why on the 19th you want to suggest a continuance to some other date to get more
Yes.
time to digest.
Yes.
I had also suggested to the counselors, because I think it's of note, I had also suggested that we re-advertise. So I talked to Diane, we're putting together to get out an ad to re-advertise that hearing. Well, it may not be statutorily required. I think given the importance of this particular ordinance to a number of parties, it made sense, I think, to me to make sure the community was aware we're back with an online meeting to discuss the same ordinance. So, in the least, we won't get complaints if people weren't aware or couldn't have been aware. So, so we're re-advertising it, and maybe Bonnie, you're thinking along those lines. It might make sense to digest it, but Councilor Eigenman and Councilor Macaulay may want to move ahead on the 19th with the discussion, but it may not be where everybody else is on the same page with that document, given that they've had a shorter amount of time to review it.
Yeah, this is where the problem is. They want to revise it and they want to push it through. Meanwhile, you and I have talked about, and you've even asked them to pull together a working committee of a broader range of people with a broader knowledge about what the implications are, to do a real revision of the existing draft. And they want to, either way, that gives us 3 weeks. If we wanted to have it ready, or maybe it's 4, I don't know, but a week before the 19th, so that it can be posted, people can review it, and then they're going to start the hearing on the 19th. I'm with Ann. I think it's unrealistic, and it looks like they're trying to push through what they want in another unbaked format. So I'm going to say one more time, slow it down.
Yeah, I definitely think a continuance is needed from the 19th, even if you feel comfortable with, looking at a document or hearing public comment that night, which I don't have any objection to per se. I do think there definitely needs to be a continuance.
I have an objection to it. That's what I'm saying. Andy, I wish I'm very frustrated. We've been through this on so many other amendments that they wanted to push through. We have some discussion on it, like you just said, you're not opposed to it. And there's a message.
I will convey to them that I think it's a mistake to try to bring that, as you pointed out, to bring that document forward as if it's ready to go on the 19th. I'm happy to convey that to them, that I agree that that's something that they may want to get out there for everybody to review, but maybe expect at a subsequent joint meeting, a continuance of the 19th to some other date certain, to do it then, just so that at least at a bare minimum, everybody has enough time to look at the same document.
Including the planning board, because the planning board would like to use the 19th as an opportunity to have zoning amendment discussion. And we now have 3 things on our agenda if we add this to it. And that would be a perfect time for us to have our own discussion of it in whatever format it's in by that time, and then ensure that the joint public hearing isn't scheduled until the first meeting in September.
Yeah, I agree with that. If I may,
Hey, Bonnie, I think it's time for your glass of wine.
But am I doing what you want? I mean, I'm going on what you want.
No, I agree with you.
I want to just make sure, because I can't tell everything from video, only the look on your face.
I will certainly convey that to the counselors, and I'm on the same wavelength about that myself. One thing I would note, though, and again, Bonnie and some of the other planning board members who've been here for a while know that the council has still sometimes its own prerogative and right to push forward with things, maybe disagree on the timeline. I don't always agree with those timelines myself, but was worth noting for your context here that part of the reason why they may be a little bit resistant, although I will have that discussion with them for sure, they may be a little bit resistant to not having some discussion on the 19th about it, even if it's a late, version that's been distributed, is because, unfortunately, Councilor Agaman had an exchange with someone via email who is complaining about a short-term rental unit that's being operated next to them, and suggested essentially that the current ordinances do not allow it as a use at all, meaning none of the short-term rental units essentially in the city are illegal. I'm not sure I agree with that interpretation of the ordinance. I think that there is some case law on that I think is on point and makes sense, but I think it's quite a drastic position to take that the zoning administrators should shut down a short-term rental unit right now when we have a bunch of these and interested parties, that it might be a better way of dealing with it to get a short-term rental units ordinance on the books. So unfortunately, because that party was encouraged to essentially appeal and intervene to try to shut down one short-term rental unit, they may have a desire to make sure that the planning board here and the city council are discussing the short-term rental unit as soon as possible, because it's been on the back burner for a while.
This is really unfortunate that they have put it off and put it off. And now all of a sudden, because something's come up, they're going to have a knee-jerk reaction and try to put a half-baked zoning ordinance, well, a zoning ordinance that hasn't been fully vetted by the planning board, which they could care less about anyway. But in the end, it will be doing zoning in public one more time. And that's the last time I'm going to say that. All right.
Madam Chair, would you take a motion to adjourn?
As long as there are no other updates from the staff. Are there any other updates?
No, I may reach out to a few of you just to talk individually about the Institution for Savings project. You know, I don't have any other particular updates to spend time with you on this evening.
Why would you reach out to a few people?
Well, I'd like to reach all of you, but I know some of you had some particularly more stronger, clearer points that you were concerned about at the last meeting. And so I wanted to walk through some of that with each of you without necessarily deliberating on it tonight. I just wanted to make sure that I could reach out and discuss those with you a little bit so that each of the board members, and particularly those that might have had comments that, you know, again, to the extent that individual board members are addressing very well the ordinance provisions, or raising concerns that might actually be problematic for either the board or the applicant going forward. I'd rather walk through some of those things, you know, individually before the meeting than have those things play out at the meeting.
And can I confirm, Rick, you were volunteering if we do have a working group on short-term rentals to join me?
Yes,
Okay.
unless anybody else wants to do it.
I don't hear a groundswell or see a bunch of hands going up.
I'll assume that now that Rick is joining us then.
Okay.
So,
And if we have a meeting, fine. If you don't hear anything about it, then you know counselors are doing their thing. And we'll see it on the 19th. All right, motion to adjourn, please.
So moved, Ann.
Second,
Second, Alden?
I'll take a roll call on that. Alden,
Yes.
Beth,
Yes.
Ann,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ. MJ on adjourning. She's
With us?
muted and she doesn't know it. I can see her lips moving. She said yes. Don Walters,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thanks, everybody.